The Vigilance drifted silently through the endless black void of space, its hull barely a speck against the swirling chaos of distant stars. On board, the tension was palpable, a weight that pressed on the minds of every crew member. Outside, the Zorath Coalition's warships loomed, dark shadows filling the sky over Terath 9, the human colony they had sworn to erase. Captain Lila Renner stood at the bridge's command center, hands clasped behind her back, staring out through the viewport. Her expression was unreadable, but her mind raced. The Zorath fleet had arrived faster than they anticipated, an armada of sleek, angular ships that looked more like predatory creatures than vessels of war. Each one could devastate the colony within hours, and the Vigilance was all that stood between them and humanity's extinction on this barren world. "Captain, we're picking up communications from the Coalition flagship," came the voice of Lieutenant Breck, the communications officer. His hands hovered over the controls, his eyes never leaving the monitors. "They're demanding we surrender. They've issued an ultimatum." Lila's jaw tightened. "What exactly are they saying?" "They claim that if we don't yield, they'll wipe us out," Breck replied, his voice clipped. "They're underestimating us, Captain. They think we're just a nuisance." Lila's lips twitched into a grim smile. "That's exactly what they think. And that's why they'll fail." She turned sharply, pacing across the bridge. "Tell them to keep broadcasting. I want everyone to hear this." "Aye, Captain." Breck relayed the order, and soon, a harsh voice echoed through the command center. "This is High Commander Orkith Zor of the Zorath Coalition. Surrender now, or face the consequences. Your world will be wiped clean of all life, and your people will become nothing more than a forgotten footnote in the history of the galaxy. This is your last warning." Lila's eyes narrowed. She'd heard that voice before, arrogant, dripping with condescension. Orkith Zor was more than just a military leader, he was a zealot, convinced of the superiority of his species, blind to humanity's tenacity. "Shut it off," Lila commanded, her voice cold and sharp. The transmission cut abruptly. She turned to her officers, who watched her expectantly. "We're not here to negotiate," she said, her tone unwavering. "Our job is simple. Hold the line until reinforcements arrive. I'm not about to let a bunch of self-righteous aliens destroy this colony." Her eyes flicked to the tactical display, showing the positions of the Zorath ships. There were over 30 warships, each one more advanced than anything humanity had fielded so far. The odds were impossible. Yet, she wasn't afraid. If there was one thing humans excelled at, it was surviving the impossible. "Status on the defenses?" she asked, keeping her focus on the screen. "Planetary shields are holding, but we're only able to keep them up for another hour, maybe less. If we don't engage them soon, they'll disable the shields and start their bombardment," Lieutenant Riven, the tactical officer, responded. "We have minimal forces, Captain. The Zorath ships have superior firepower and shields." Lila's gaze softened, but her resolve hardened. "We'll make them regret that mistake." She turned back to the bridge crew, her voice low but confident. "Prepare to engage at maximum range. We won't give them a clear shot at the colony. All fighters are to launch on my command. Tell the ground teams to dig in. This is going to get messy." As the crew scrambled into action, Lila sat in the command chair, her fingers moving over the controls with practiced precision. Every move, every decision she made, could mean the difference between life and death for thousands. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself. "Captain," Riven called, looking over his console, "we've identified an opening in their formation. If we push hard and fast, we could take out their flagship." "It's risky." "We're human," Lila interrupted, her eyes blazing with determination. "We're all about taking risks. Take that shot." Riven didn't need to be told twice. Within seconds, the Vigilance was moving into position, its engines firing as it accelerated toward the heart of the enemy formation. The Zorath ships, caught off guard by the sudden maneuver, scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The Vigilance's turrets opened fire, beams of concentrated energy lancing through space toward their target. The flagship's shields flared briefly before faltering. The Zorath forces retaliated with brutal precision, their return fire shaking the ship to its core. Lila's grip tightened on the armrest as she fought to maintain control of the helm. "Shields holding at 40%, Captain." Breck shouted, his voice tinged with alarm. "Increase power to forward shields." Lila ordered, her voice calm but commanding. "We can't afford to take another hit like that." "Fighter squadrons are launching, Captain," Riven reported. "We're drawing fire from their support ships, but our fighters are engaging." Lila nodded, a small measure of satisfaction welling up inside her. The Vigilance was no longer just a ship, it was a symbol. A symbol of human defiance. "Tell the squadrons to stay on their toes," Lila instructed. "The Zorath are smart. They won't let us get away with this." Her gaze shifted back to the flagship's position on the display. Orkith Zor might have underestimated them, but that would be his mistake. The humans had learned how to survive by adapting, by doing the unthinkable. And now, the Vigilance was about to show him just what that meant. A sudden explosion rattled the ship, sending a jolt through the bridge. Lila's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she barked out commands. "Status report. Direct hit to the port side, Captain. Shields are down to 30%. The Zorath flagship is retaliating, direct hit coming in. Divert all power to port shields." Lila shouted, her eyes locked on the view screen. The Vigilance lurched under the impact, but the shields held. Barely. Lila's fingers flew over the controls. The Vigilance was a fine ship, but the odds were stacked against them. Still, there was one thing she knew, no matter what, they wouldn't go down without a fight. She turned to her crew with a final command. "Keep them distracted. We'll make it through this. Trust me." The crew nodded, a renewed sense of purpose filling the room. They were in this together, and Lila knew that was what would see them through. Outside, the stars flickered as the battle unfolded, a storm of fire and light that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. The bridge of the Vigilance was a cacophony of controlled chaos. Alerts flashed across every console, and the constant hum of the engines reverberated through the hull. The Zorath forces were relentless, pressing their advantage. Despite the initial success, the Vigilance was taking heavy fire, its shields buckling under the constant assault. "Captain, their fleet is regrouping," Lieutenant Riven reported, his voice tense. "They're bringing in reinforcements from their rear line. We're outnumbered 3-1 now." Lila's eyes darted over the tactical display. The enemy ships were forming a tighter formation, preparing for a full assault on the Vigilance. The flagship was still holding back, its weapons locked on them. The strategy was clear, overwhelm them with sheer force. "How long until we can jump to FTL?" Lila asked, her gaze unwavering. "We're not in position, Captain," Riven replied, his fingers flying over the console. "Our engines are still heavily damaged from that last hit. We need at least 10 minutes. Lila clenched her jaw. 10 minutes felt like a lifetime when Zorath warships were closing in fast. She turned to Breck, who was glued to his comm station, his brow furrowed. "Status on reinforcements?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Breck shook his head. "We've sent out the distress signal, but they're still at least a few hours out. It's just us, Captain." Her fingers gripped the edge of her chair. Every officer on the bridge was aware of the cold, hard truth. Without reinforcements, they were fighting a losing battle. Still, Lila refused to concede. She wasn't going to let humanity go down without making the Zorath pay dearly for every inch of ground. "Set course for their flanks," Lila commanded. "If we can force them to split their forces, we can buy ourselves some time. Let's make them chase us." Riven blinked, surprised by the audacity of her order. "You want to turn tail and run, Captain?" "We're not running," Lila snapped. "We're outsmarting them. The Zorath think they're invincible because of their numbers. Let's show them they're not." The tactical officer hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Aye, Captain." Adjusting course. Breck tapped his console. Incoming message from the Zorath flagship. Lila took a breath. Put it through. The image of High Commander Orkith Zor filled the screen. His face, a mix of disgust and condescension, stared back at her. His alien features were sharp and angular, a cold, calculating gaze burning from his dark eyes. Human, he began, his voice dripping with contempt, I gave you the chance to save your pathetic existence. Now, you choose to prolong your inevitable demise. You will learn that defying the Zorath will only lead to your extinction. Lila's expression remained unreadable, her posture resolute. If you think we'll surrender to your threats, you're gravely mistaken, Commander. The only thing you'll be getting is a bloody nose. You may have numbers, but you're about to learn the hard way why humans are called Immortal Deathworlders. Orkith's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. Foolish words. Your people's arrogance will be your undoing. The transmission ended abruptly. Lila didn't flinch. Time to move, people, she shouted. We're taking the fight to them. The Vigilance surged forward, its engines roaring to life as it veered off its previous course. The ship jetted to the right, narrowly avoiding a barrage of enemy fire. They were now entering the thick of the Zorath formation, drawing the enemy's focus away from Terrath 9 and toward the Vigilance. Lila's gamble was simple, make the Zorath think they had the upper hand, then hit them where it hurt. Prepare to fire on my mark, Lila said, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. Once we hit their flanks, we're going full throttle. We need to break their formation. A chorus of affirmatives echoed back, and the Vigilance rocked again as another enemy shot clipped its shields. Lila could hear the tension in the bridge crew's movements, the silent fear that any moment could be their last. But she wasn't afraid. She had been through worse. Lock on targets, Riven called. We've got a clear shot at the rightmost destroyer. Lila nodded, her eyes narrowing as the Zorath destroyer came into view. The Vigilance's guns hummed with power as the tactical targeting systems locked onto the ship. The Zorath destroyer didn't stand a chance. As soon as the shot was fired, the enemy ship erupted in a burst of flames, debris scattering across the void. Target destroyed, Riven reported, his voice tense but tinged with a note of triumph. They're regrouping, but we've got them off balance. Lila allowed herself a small, grim smile. Keep the pressure on them. Don't let up. She watched as her crew worked in synchrony, each member contributing their expertise to ensure the Vigilance stayed one step ahead of their enemies. The Zorath were struggling to reorganize, their massive fleet faltering as human ingenuity and quick thinking began to turn the tide of the battle, at least for the moment. Captain, we've lost communications with some of the ground teams, Breck reported. They're reporting heavy Zorath ground assaults near the colony's perimeter. We're going to need to make a choice, protect the colony or hold the line here. Lila gritted her teeth. The colony was the lifeblood of this mission. If it fell, there would be no escape for humanity on Terrath 9. But they couldn't hold out forever if the Vigilance was destroyed. Redirect half of our fighter squadrons to assist the ground teams, Lila ordered, her mind working faster than her mouth could keep up. Tell them we're not abandoning them. But we need to finish this before we lose everything. The fighters scrambled, diving toward the planet's surface to support the beleaguered ground forces. The remaining squadrons stayed with the Vigilance, their cannons tearing into the Zorath warships. It wasn't enough to turn the tide entirely, but it was buying them time. Captain, Riven called, the Zorath flagship is repositioning, heading straight for us. They're going all in. If we don't deal with them, this will end in disaster. Lila's mind raced. The flagship had been holding back, likely waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now, it was charging straight into their path, intent on finishing the battle in one decisive blow. She knew what she had to do. Helm, adjust course to intercept, she commanded. All weapons, fire at will. With a fierce roar, the Vigilance turned, locking its sights on the flagship. The Zorath ship's weapons charged, preparing to obliterate them in one shot. But the Vigilance was faster. Before the flagship could fire, a precise volley from their main cannons cracked the Zorath flagship's shields. Another barrage and the flagship's weapon systems went dark. Lila's breath caught. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had made their mark. For now, they had the upper hand. "Damage report," Lila ordered, turning to her crew. "We're holding," Riven said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "But their numbers are still overwhelming. We can't keep this up much longer." Lila's jaw clenched, but she nodded. "We don't need much longer. We just need to make them bleed." Outside, the battle raged on. The Vigilance wasn't just a ship anymore, it was a symbol. And as long as it still flew, humanity had a fighting chance. The Vigilance shuddered under another violent impact, the deck vibrating as enemy fire pummeled its shields. Captain Lila Renner barely noticed. She was too focused, her eyes fixed on the unfolding chaos on the view screen. The Zorath fleet was regrouping, each ship more determined than the last. Despite the initial blows, the human ship had bought time, but the odds were growing slimmer by the minute. "Captain, shields at 12%. Lieutenant Riven's voice cut through the tension. "If they hit us with another salvo like that, we'll be sitting ducks." Lila's gaze didn't waver. "Keep firing. Get us close enough to disable their flagship. We take that down, and their morale will collapse." Riven looked back at her, incredulous. "You really think we can take out the flagship with what we've got left?" "We're human," Lila said, her voice steady, cutting through the desperation. "We always find a way." A series of high-pitched beeps echoed across the bridge. Breck, the communications officer, looked up from his console. "Captain, we've got an incoming message from the Zorath flagship. Orkith Zor again." Lila's jaw tightened. "Put it through." The image of High Commander Orkith Zor flickered to life on the display. His expression was cold, but there was something different in his eyes now, perhaps a hint of anger, or realization that the humans weren't as easy to crush as he thought. "Human," he spat, his voice venomous. "I warned you. You defy the Zorath at your own peril. Your fleet is crippled. Your shields are weakening. It's only a matter of time before we eradicate you and your kind." Lila's face was hard as stone, her voice cutting through his threats like a knife. "You're wrong, Orkith. It's not a matter of time. It's a matter of us making sure you never forget the price of underestimating humanity. We're not just a nuisance. We're your nightmare." Orkitha's lips curled in a sneer. "You're deluded. We'll see how long you can hold on to that bravado. The Zorath will crush you." The transmission ended, and the silence in the room was palpable, broken only by the constant hum of the ship's systems and the distant thunder of the ongoing battle. Lila's knuckles whitened on the armrest of her chair, but she remained composed. "Status on reinforcements?" Lila asked, still staring at the tactical display. Her mind was racing with calculations, possibilities. Breck shook his head. "Still several hours out, Captain. We're alone in this." The weight of those words hit like a hammer, but Lila wasn't shaken. She had expected nothing less. She knew the situation was grim, but she wasn't about to give up. Not when so much was at stake. "Riven, give me a firing solution on that flagship. I don't care if we're out of ammo, we're going to make every shot count." Riven hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "Aye, Captain. Adjusting targeting systems now." Lila's eyes flicked to the readouts. Their shields were barely holding on, and the enemy was closing in fast. The Vigilance was fast, nimble, but it was no match for the full force of the Zorath fleet. Still, it had one advantage the Zorath didn't: humanity's unparalleled ability to adapt under pressure. "Tell the fighter squadrons to prep for one last strike," Lila ordered, her voice hardening. "We need to break their formation, buy us a few precious seconds." Her eyes never left the screen. The Zorath flagship, looming just ahead, was a terrifying sight. But she could see it now, the cracks in its armor. The Zorath had underestimated the human will to survive, and now, they would pay for it. "Captain, we've lost 2 fighter squadrons," Riven reported. "The remaining ones are holding their ground, but they're heavily outnumbered." We can't afford to lose them. Lila clenched her jaw. Then we make sure they don't. Give them everything we've got. This is it. We either break them now or we die trying. The Vigilance lurched as another volley slammed into its side, the ship groaning under the strain. The crew's eyes were locked on their stations, fingers flying over consoles, operating like clockwork. They were human, and this was their moment. Enemy flagship is in range, Riven said, his voice tight. Ready to fire on your mark. Lila took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the flagship's looming form. It was now or never. She could feel the weight of the moment, the lives of everyone on Terrath 9, the future of humanity, all hanging by a thread. Fire everything we've got, she commanded, her voice unwavering. The Vigilance unleashed its fury. Beams of concentrated energy shot forward, slamming into the flagship's shields. The Zorath flagship recoiled under the force, but its shields held firm. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. They were so close. Shields failing. Riven shouted. We've got a clean shot at their engines. One more strike and they're ours. Do it, Lila ordered, leaning forward in her chair. Give them no time to recover. A final volley erupted from the Vigilance, a concentrated barrage aimed directly at the heart of the flagship. The flagship's shields flickered, then failed entirely. The blast struck with devastating precision, and the ship's central engines erupted in a violent fireball. The Zorath flagship lurched, its systems going dark as it began to drift, crippled. Flagship destroyed, Riven reported, his voice a mixture of disbelief and triumph. We did it. The Zorath flagship is down. The room erupted in cheers, but Lila wasn't celebrating. There was still work to be done. Stay focused, people, she said, her voice cutting through the euphoria. We've won a battle, but the war's not over. Get ready for their retaliation. They won't give up this easily. As if on cue, the Zorath forces began to regroup, their remaining ships scrambling to reorganize. But Lila could see it now, their morale was shattered. The loss of their flagship had struck a blow to their confidence, and the human defiance was having its effect. The Zorath were no longer a unified front. There were fractures. All fighters, regroup and prepare for a final assault, Lila ordered. We end this now. The remaining squadrons took flight, diving into the chaos once more. But the Zorath, shaken by the loss of their leader, were no longer operating with the same precision. They were reacting, not planning. Enemy fleet is scattering, Riven reported. They're breaking formation. Lila leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a brief moment of relief. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in hours, she could see the edge of victory. We've made our mark, she said softly. Now let's finish it. Outside, the stars seemed to burn brighter as the Vigilance and its fighters pressed forward, cutting through the fractured Zorath fleet. The human spirit was a force unlike anything the Zorath had ever faced. And as the Vigilance continued its charge, Lila knew one thing for sure, no matter the odds, humanity would always find a way to survive. The battle in the cold depths of space raged on, but the tide had turned. The Zorath, once an unstoppable force, were now scattered, their ships in disarray. Their flagship, once a symbol of their invincibility, had been reduced to drifting wreckage. Humanity, the so-called Immortal Deathworlders, had struck a blow that would be felt across the stars. But the victory came with a heavy price. Lila Renner stood at the edge of the Vigilance's bridge, staring at the debris that floated around the battlefield. The Zorath fleet was retreating, but the cost of this battle had been high. Their numbers had thinned significantly, and many lives had been lost, both in space and on the ground. Humanity's determination had pushed them forward, but it was the sacrifice of so many that had made this moment possible. Captain, enemy fleet is retreating, as expected, Riven's voice pulled her back to the present. His face was pale, his eyes tired, but there was a quiet relief in them. We've won. The Zorath are pulling back. They've lost their morale, and we've crippled their flagship. It's over. Lila took a long breath and exhaled slowly. Not yet, she muttered under her breath. Despite the retreat, there was a nagging feeling in her gut. The Zorath had been far too confident, and she knew better than to think that the threat was fully extinguished. "We've inflicted significant losses," Breck said, his fingers dancing over his console. "The fleet is retreating to Zorath Prime, but they'll lick their wounds and come back. The Zorath don't give up that easily." Lila nodded, her mind already moving past the immediate battle. "Get me a direct line to command. We need to report in. We've just bought ourselves some time, but it won't last long." She moved to the center of the bridge, her mind focused, her voice commanding. "Riven, Breck, we need to prepare for a second round. I know we've sent our fighters out, but there's a lot of cleanup to do. We can't just leave our people stranded." "Understood, Captain," Riven said. He exchanged a look with Breck, who was already pulling up new flight data. The Vigilance had seen better days, but it wasn't finished yet. The human crew had become a testament to what true resilience meant. They had fought like they had nothing to lose because they understood the cost of failure. The communications line opened, and Lila's heart sank when she saw the face of General Caden, the leader of the Tereth 9 Defense Forces. His face was grim, streaked with exhaustion and sorrow, but there was a glint of respect in his eyes. "Lila," Caden's voice was a low growl, thick with emotion. "We did it. The Zorath are retreating, but at a terrible cost. The colony, it's not looking good. We've lost over half of our forces in the ground defense, and the Zorath still have strongholds on the planet." Lila's stomach twisted. "What's the situation on the ground now? What can we still do to help?" "Evacuations are in progress, but we're going to need more than just cover. The remaining Zorath forces are digging in, and they're not going to go quietly. The fighters we've sent are doing their best, but they need more support," Caden replied, his voice taut. "I'm not sure we can keep them back for much longer." Lila bit her lip. There was no denying it, the Vigilance had bought the colony time, but the ground forces were still facing a brutal battle. And though the Zorath had suffered losses in space, they were far from defeated. "Tell the ground teams to hold on," Lila said, her voice steady. "We're sending reinforcements as soon as we can. Get the civilian evacuation to the high ground, and we'll cover you from orbit. You're not alone in this." She disconnected the call and turned to her crew. "Get those squadrons ready for another run. We're not done yet. I need to clear out those Zorath strongholds, or we risk losing everything we've fought for." Riven's voice was full of resolve as he nodded. "We'll keep pushing, Captain. We'll make sure they don't get away with this." Lila turned to Breck. "Send a message to every Allied fleet in the sector. We need all the support we can get. The Zorath might be retreating, but I won't trust them to stay down for long." Breck quickly tapped his console, sending out the distress signal to any nearby human forces. The battle may have been won, but Lila knew that this war was far from over. There would be no true peace until the Zorath understood that humanity could never be crushed. As the Vigilance moved into position above Tereth 9, Lila allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The ground teams were still fighting. Her people were still fighting. They were showing the Zorath exactly why humanity had earned the moniker of Immortal Deathworlders. The ship's engines hummed as it prepared for another assault, but in that moment, Lila knew that this battle had forged something even greater than victory. It had forged a legacy of resistance, of defiance, of survival. The Zorath might have thought they could crush humanity under their heel, but they had only awakened something far worse for them: humanity's will to fight, to endure, and to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. "Get ready," Lila said softly to her crew. "This isn't over. And we're going to make sure it's the Zorath's final mistake." The Vigilance surged forward, the next phase of the battle beginning as the crew's eyes steeled with determination. Humanity had sent a clear message: the Zorath had made the mistake of underestimating them. Now, they would learn why humans were known as the Immortal Deathworlders. And the cost would be one they would never forget. The Vigilance glided slowly through the battlefield, its systems dimmed and battered, but still functioning. The debris of Zorath warships floated around them like tombstones of their enemies. Though victory had been achieved, the price of that victory had been far steeper than anyone had imagined. It was a bittersweet triumph. Humanity had repelled the invasion, but the scars were deep. On the bridge, Lila Renner sat quietly in her command chair, her fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the armrest. Her face was streaked with exhaustion, but there was a grim satisfaction in her eyes. They had fought and won, but the cost was heavy. "Captain," Riven's voice cut through the silence, his tone subdued. "The last of the Zorath forces are retreating from the planet. The remaining resistance on Terrath 9 has been neutralized, and we're picking up the last survivors." Lila nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Terrath 9, once a thriving colony, had been all but destroyed in the assault. The ground forces had done their best, but the Zorath were merciless, and their strike had been devastating. Civilians had been evacuated, but many had already perished in the crossfire. "We saved what we could," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It's more than we could have hoped for." Riven gave her a sharp look, and then nodded. "More than we could have hoped for, but the cost is high. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of lives lost on the ground. The colony will take years to rebuild." Lila sighed. "I know. But if we hadn't fought back, if we hadn't made them bleed, we'd all be dead. At least now we've made them realize something. We're not going down without a fight. We never will." Her eyes hardened as she stared out at the vastness of space. "We've shown the galaxy what humanity is capable of. And we've set a precedent." A voice from the comm system interrupted her thoughts. "Captain Renner, we've received a message from the High Command." Lila straightened in her seat, refocusing. "Patch it through." The face of Admiral Salder appeared on the screen. He looked weary, his uniform dirty, but there was a measure of pride in his eyes. "Captain Renner, you and your crew have done the impossible. The Zorath have been driven back from Terrath 9, and their fleet is in full retreat. Your actions have turned the tide of the war. Humanity will remember this day." Lila inclined her head. "We couldn't have done it without the support of our ground forces, Admiral. The people of Terrath 9 fought bravely, and their sacrifice cannot be forgotten." Salder's expression softened. "Their bravery will be remembered, Captain. As for you and your crew, your actions have proven that humanity is a force to be reckoned with. The Zorath will never forget this defeat. And neither will the rest of the galaxy." Lila's mind raced as she absorbed his words. The Zorath had made a critical miscalculation. They had underestimated the will of humanity. But she also knew that this victory would not make humanity any safer. There were still enemies out there, waiting for a chance to strike, to test if humanity had truly learned how to defend itself. "We'll be ready, Admiral," she said firmly. "But we need time to rebuild, and we need reinforcements. We've taken a heavy toll, and there are still pockets of Zorath loyalists operating in the region." "Understood," the Admiral replied. "You'll have the support you need. Rest assured, Captain, this victory will reverberate throughout the galaxy." As the transmission ended, Lila felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. But there was no time for rest. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Epilogue, A New Dawn. Weeks passed, and the remnants of the Zorath fleet scattered to the farthest reaches of space, regrouping and rethinking their strategy. The Vigilance remained in orbit around Terrath 9, now serving as the headquarters for the human military forces in the sector. The colony was in ruins, but the survivors had begun the long, painful process of rebuilding. The human spirit was resilient, and the people of Terrath 9 would rise again. Captain Lila Renner stood at the observation window, gazing out at the stars. She had seen so much destruction, so much loss, but she had also seen the strength of her people. It was a strength the Zorath had underestimated, and it was a strength that would carry them through whatever came next. "Captain, we've received word that the Zorath have pulled back to Zorath Prime," Riven reported, entering the bridge. "They're regrouping, but they've lost their edge. They're not coming back for a while." Lila's lips curled into a faint smile. Good. Let them lick their wounds. We've made our point. We've earned a little peace, Riven said, sitting down at the tactical console. But I know you. You're already thinking ahead. Lila turned her gaze from the stars to Riven, her expression serious once more. We've bought some time. But we need to prepare. The Zorath will return. And the galaxy will take notice of humanity. We'll be ready. The Vigilance's engines hummed softly, and Lila stood there for a moment, taking it all in. They had won this battle, and humanity had sent a message. The galaxy now knew what humanity could do when pushed to the brink. The Immortal Deathworlders were no longer a myth. They were a reality. And the Zorath had learned, the hard way, why humanity was the one species they would never, ever be able to conquer.